Welcome to Flipped Classroom. Today's lesson is a review of Volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Chapter 1 begins with the Bennet women's reaction to Bingley leaving. Jane is heartbroken, yet she's relieved because at least she knows her conduct in front of Mr. Bingley was appropriate, therefore she followed all the rules of society. Unlike her mother, who's quite humiliated, because in Volume 1, Chapter 18, she arranges a ball, getting ahead of herself, assuming a marriage proposal is in the works. Elizabeth learns a key lesson from the whole situation. As stated, inconsistency of all human character. She's referring to, she believes that first impressions can be very misleading. Ironically, it is her first impressions of Darcy that are quite misleading. Chapter 2 takes a closer look at Mr. Garner's view of love. According to her, she feels that Mr. Bingley was indeed, quote, violently in love, with a negative connotation, meaning that this kind of love is more like infatuation. It's puppy love. It is not true affection and won't be lasting. And Elizabeth believes that Bingley will never come and visit Great Street Church because that is a trade and commerce district. And since Mr. Bingley always wants to keep away from his mercantile roots far behind him, he would not be coming to the area. Therefore, there's no chance that Jane and Bingley will have another encounter. Chapter 3 focuses on Mr. Wickham. Mrs. Garner advises Elizabeth not to marry Wickham because neither of them have sufficient fortune. The deeper meaning of this is that she too considers marriage to be a financial institution as opposed to a union based on love. Eventually, Mr. Wickham does lose interest in Elizabeth. He meets another woman, showing that he also has more interest in a woman's fortune than the woman herself. In Chapter 4, we see Elizabeth, who's visiting her sister. Of course, Jane has been very disappointed in love and is recovering and eventually will have happiness. And on her way to visit, she meets her friend, who is successful in courting and marriage, but is most likely not happy. So the audience sees the contrast between someone who's in a marriage for financial means as opposed to being in love for emotional reasons. In Chapter 5, Austen reveals Elizabeth's humorous attitude towards Mr. Collins. Elizabeth expects Mr. Collins to behave in his usual boastful, self-important manner. So when she arrives, she's ready to hear Mr. Collins show off his home and boast about his relationship with Lady Catherine. So Austen uses this humorous tone to indicate that Elizabeth knows Mr. Collins well and has accepted him for the foolish man he is. Also, Elizabeth notices that Charlotte can now enjoy her life only when she's able to forget about Mr. Collins and withdraw from his presence. So Elizabeth determines that by Charlotte's evident enjoyment, he must be often forgotten. So clearly Charlotte and Collins' marriage is not the partnership of two equals that Elizabeth believes a marriage should be. In Chapter 6, Elizabeth finds Lady Catherine to be that proud and self-important woman, very similar to Darcy. She also sees Lady Catherine as having this strong desire to preserve the difference between the social classes and to prevent class mobility. Mr. Darcy has demonstrated again and again that he disapproves of Mr. Bingley's attraction to Jane because of her middle-class family. Also, Lady Catherine in this chapter finds Elizabeth to be too independent and too straightforward. She thinks Elizabeth is just too quick to voice her opinion and that she has a tendency towards disobedience when she does not reveal her age to Lady Catherine right away. These criticisms are significant for both a generalization and social standpoint. Generationally, Elizabeth should be more obedient to her elders. Socially, she should be more obedient to her social superiors. More importantly, however, she's displaying the type of middle-class behavior that the refined upper class would definitely consider presumptuous. So Elizabeth clearly does not know her place, according to Lady Catherine. Chapter 8 takes a look at the dining event at Rosine Park. Here, Lady Catherine does invite Mr. Collins and Charlotte, but only when she cannot surround herself with better company. So as soon as Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam arrive, she doesn't need the Collins anymore for entertainment or diversion any longer, so she quickly brushes them off. Also, pay key attention to the sarcastic tone used in the dialogue between Elizabeth and Darcy. Clearly they are teasing, yet there is a hint of resentfulness seen in this dialogue. In Chapter 9, Mr. Darcy commits one of the biggest social gaffes of the time. He visits uninvited, kind of like a familiar friend might, when he goes to see Elizabeth in the house alone. It is very highly improper for a gentleman to entertain a lady, or vice versa, without the company of chaperones. So the fact that Darcy comes in invited and just happens to find Elizabeth home suggests he does have a strong desire to see her. And during this chapter, we'll also see that Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth have very differing opinions on distance, specifically the distance between Colin's home and Elizabeth's homes, because that's a reflection on social class. Mr. Darcy can easily afford a comfortable carriage that can definitely take him the 50 miles, but Elizabeth's family cannot. So their differing ideas of what it means to be close really does indicate how different they are socially. Austen's description of the encounter between Darcy and Elizabeth is very interesting and revealing. She writes, "He certainly looked at her a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there was much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but absence of mind." Okay, so when looking at this, clearly Mr. Darcy's initial attraction to Elizabeth's beautiful eyes is slowly being replaced by something deeper, something more sincere for her regard of her character. So Mr. Darcy's affection is not that violent infatuation that the Garners refer to, but more of a sincere, steady, growing feeling of love. In Chapter 10, Elizabeth tries to answer the question, did Darcy actually try to stop the marriage between Jane and Mr. Bingley? Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam implies that Darcy did try to stop the marriage. He relates the story to Elizabeth about how Mr. Darcy interfered for a friend, and Elizabeth instantly assumes that friend is Mr. Bingley getting married or having interest in Jane. She definitely reacts with anger, and she believes that it was pride that drove Mr. Darcy to influence his friend. Or the other possibility is that he wants to secure Bingley for his own sister, Georgiana.